Politics and government. Progressivism was alive and well in the 1920s, particularly in western states and with President Harding, who proposed anti-lynching laws, as well as Calvin Coolidge, who supported women's suffrage. Progressivism was an idea more than an organized political union, and the ideas such as suffrage, anti-lynching, and temperance were still extremely prevalent during the 1920s. Women furthered their agenda after the success of the suffrage movement and other initiatives in the 1920s, such as peace, lobbying, maternal care, support for education, and public health. These were not prestigious or glorious pursuits, but women during the 20s worked diligently and with great results. Progressivism as an idea was very crucial in the 20s. American progressivism spilled over into Europe, and these European countries followed American progressive ideals to the letter all throughout the 20s. Economics. In the 1920s, America became the wealthiest nation on earth. As such, it is clear that the 20s were most certainly a boom time and not a boom to bust cycle. During this time, almost all Americans had a well-paying job, and during Coolidge's administration, the unemployment rate was at 1%. Many people did the hard labor during this time, as technology had not become too prevalent. One of the main reasons America saw such a boom during the 20s was a rampant consumerism. Many Americans spent rather than saved their money, and reintroduced it back into the economy. Many times they, as was the case for those working for the Ford Motor Company, reinvested their money back into the economy they worked for. As a result, this massive consumerism stimulated the economy. Cultural clashes. The 1920s was a period of conflict between people and ideas. Americans were very anti-immigration and did not want new immigrants coming. The Immigration Act of 1924 prevented Japanese from coming to the U.S. and set immigration quotas. Despite prohibition, many people in the Roaring Twenties continued to drink illegally. New women wore shorter skirts, drank with the men, smoked, and swore in public, which all clashed with traditional views of Victorian women. More people moved to cities, which traditionalists in the countryside thought cities were evil and immoral. These two anarchists, Sacco and Vanzetti, were found guilty of first-degree murder, and on the day before their execution, a mob of 20,000 people formed. Diplomacy and foreign affairs. Americans were very much in favor of internationalism, as evidenced by the Harding administration's disarmament and foreign policy. Americans feared that America might become too isolated if it did not partake in the League of Nations, and the government favored having conferences to discuss their support of internationalism. For instance, the Four-Power Pact ultimately guaranteed a stronger U.S. presence in the Pacific, and Americans also saw the Nine-Power Pact take hold, supporting the idea of an open-door policy with China. Moreover, internationalists during the 20s also created educational facilities to further their beliefs and movements, such as the Foreign Policy Association, which reported on international affairs to many Americans. During this time, organizations such as the Carnegie Endowment worked closely with the U.S. government officials to work on creating a unified form of international law. Ultimately, many Americans during the 20s favored and fostered internationalism. Mass culture. Frederick Lewis Allen called the 1920s, quote, the revolution in manners and morals, end quote. The Jazz Age was most definitely a carefree time. The Roaring Twenties saw the mass production of the automobile, the radio, and the videophone and movie tone. In 1920, the first radio station broadcast was held. In 1922, Americans spent $60 million purchasing radios. By 1929, they had spent $843 million. The first sound movie aired on December 15, 1927, and soon enough, the silent screen was doomed. The 1920s flew in the face of Victorian morals. Popular culture and magazines suggested that sex is the most important thing in life, that inhibitions are not to be tolerated, and that sin is an out-of-date term. Before the 1920s, parents would chaperone their kids at dances and parties. When the mass production of the closed car came around in the beginning of the 20s, kids found their own protected space, away from the eyes of elders. One angry judge even went as far as to call it a house of prostitution on wheels. Installment buying was also started in the 1920s. The 5 down, 5 a month, pay now, buy now, pay later culture that we are so fond of today first started here. Women also made great strides during the 20s. Skirts and hair both became shorter, while more and more were seen drinking in speakeasies and smoking in public. In 1919, men would have been shocked knowing that women in 1929 used words like hell and damn in their vocabulary quite regularly.
Created using Powtoon.